Welcome students, NIC employees, community members, and visitors, Mr. Valeriani. My name is Nils Rosedal. I teach the journalism courses here at North Idaho College. I apologize for our gray weather. We tell Californians that it's this way all the time. Okay. Welcome to our third day of the NIC Popcorn Forum. This series is entitled The Issues of Censorship in America. Is the First Amendment Dead? This series is sponsored by the Idaho Centennial Commission and NIC Convocations. Our speaker's talk will be followed by a question and answer period. Participants at that are welcome to use the center microphone after this speech. A response panel will follow at 1 o'clock in the Bonner Room of the Student Union Building. And again, the public is completely welcome to that. After today's speech and at the Bonner Room, t-shirts addressing the topic of the convocation series are available for $8 right out here at this door and at the Bonner Room. Richard Valeriani will address several freedom of the press issues and the responsibilities of the media under the First Amendment. He will discuss the role of the media in Operation Desert Storm, as well as the CNN and General Noriega tape controversy. Mr. Valeriani, who speaks Spanish, Italian, and French, joined NBC News in 1961 in Havana, but returned to the United States following the Bay of Pigs invasion in May of that year. After spending a year covering stories throughout Latin America, he was assigned to the Chicago Bureau. From there, he covered the civil rights stories in Birmingham and Selma, anti-American riots in Panama, and the fighting in the Dominican Republic in 1965. He joined NBC's Washington Bureau in 1965 and frequently covered the White House during President Lyndon Johnson's reign. After covering the campaigns of both Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey, he was assigned to the White House. In 1970, he was named State Department correspondent and remained on that beat until returning to the White House in 1972, in time to cover President Nixon's first visit to the Soviet Union. Mr. Valeriani reported on the unraveling of the Nixon White House during Watergate before going back to the State Department in 1973. From November 1973 until December 1976, he logged more than 500,000 miles covering Secretary of State Henry Kissinger on his frequent overseas missions. He also covered Secretaries of State Cyrus Vance and Edmund Muskie. Mr. Valeriani is author of the critically acclaimed book, Travels with Henry. A native of Camden, New Jersey, he was graduated from Yale University. He spent a year studying at the University of Pavia in Italy before serving in the U.S. Army for 2 years. Mr. Valeriani is not brand new to the Northwest. In fact, he was here in November when he spoke at Gonzaga University. A little bit of his knowledge of what might be happening with the Persian Gulf War was printed from his speech in the Gonzaga University Bulletin student newspaper. The article began with, this was in November, the war started in January. Quote, "War with Iraq is inevitable, and U.S. troops will be withdrawn from the Middle East by March." Okay, a little bit of forecast there. quote, the American troops will need to be out of the area in time for the annual pilgrimage in the Middle East, he said. January and February is the best climatic season to fight a war in the desert. And no one wants American soldiers in the way as the Muslim pilgrimage begins in March. I got this little tidbit when I attended a conference last week at Gonzaga. Interestingly enough, the title of this conference gives a good topic to introduce him to you now. The topic was, if the Army wanted you to have a free press, it would have issued you one. Mr. Valeriani.
Thank you, Nils. I'm sorry you had to cut that short. Good morning, and thank you all for coming. Originally, when I asked Tony Stewart what I should talk about this morning, he said I should talk about 40 minutes. Glad you didn't say 60 minutes. But appropriately for, obviously for this week, I am going to talk about the responsibilities of the media. And to begin at the beginning, the first responsibility of the media, obviously, is to report the news, and that's where the trouble starts. The question is, what is news? If I were to ask you, each of you here, I'd probably get a different answer from every one of you, a different definition. The glib answer is, news is whatever an editor decides it is, because an editor of a newspaper, executive producer of a news program, executive producers, nightly news, all decide what's going to be in the program because there isn't enough time or space to put everything. But I think that for the purpose of our discussion this morning, we need a more comprehensive definition. So let me suggest this. News records change, which is interesting and or important, and which is seen by an outsider on behalf of other outsiders. Now that's very important because you, especially at a university, you are often insiders. And insiders are often critical of what is done by us, the outsiders. Of course, in university situations, you will be insiders and frequently critical. But in almost all other situations, you are outsiders, and we, as outsiders, are reporting for you also as outsiders. Now, one of the complaints in this regard that's frequently voiced about the media is that they report too much bad news. As Edward R. Murrow once said, good news is no news. Or as they say in Washington, D.C., if you can't say something nice about somebody, let me hear it. There's an Anne Murray song that goes, there's a local paper rolled up in a rubber band. One more sad stories, one more than I can stand. Just once, how I'd like to see the headlines say, not much to print today. Couldn't find nothing bad to say. Well, there is a, since this is the popcorn forum, there is a kernel of validity in language. It'll get worse now. There is a lot of so-called bad news because the media do report what goes wrong. They do report conflict, controversy, contradiction. That does not make them con artists. In his book, The Kingdom and the Power, Gay Talese wrote, most journalists are restless voyeurs who see the warts on the world, the imperfections in people and places. The sane scene that is much of life, the great portion of the planet unmarked by madness, does not lure them like riots and raids, crumbling countries and sinking ships, bankers banished to Rio and burning Buddhist nuns. Gloom is their game, the spectacle their passion, normality their nemesis. The classic example of the media's dilemma in this regard is the plane that goes down. Planes fly between Spokane and Seattle all day long, every day, and you pay no attention to them. But as soon as one of them goes down, you want to know all you can about it. Let me suggest here that the only thing worse than knowing about all the bad news would be not knowing about it. The complaint about an excess of bad news is usually heard from government officials, especially those in the nation's capital. Well, there was a newspaper in the nation's capital which did report only good news. The nation was the Soviet Union, the capital was Moscow, and the paper was Pravda, which ironically is the Russian word for truth. As I once read in Time magazine in the letters to the editor column, following the deaths of Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko, I hope I never read that an American president is in the 8th week of a severe cold. Perhaps some of you know about the headline which appeared in Pravda following the disaster at Chernobyl. It read, "Ukrainians enjoy surprise vacation with free truck rides." Another headline was probably inadvertent. It described the entrant from Kiev in the Miss Ukraine contest as radiant. Glasnost, of course, has changed some of that, but it should still be remembered that, and noted, that the massive cover-up by the Soviet government at Chernobyl unnecessarily endangered the lives and well-being of thousands of human beings in the Soviet Union itself and elsewhere. And it underlined the affirmation that one of the chief responsibilities of the media is to tell us when and where our society is not functioning properly. And in that regard, sometimes we function as the court of last resort. In this context, I must emphasize that journalists are not the ones who are responsible for the so-called bad news they cover and report. In ancient Persia, messengers bearing bad news to kings and emperors had their heads chopped off, and I think the metaphorical equivalent sometimes happens to the media these days. One well-known example was the case involving former President Ronald Reagan when he was doing a mic check for one of his radio broadcasts. And even though he's an old broadcaster, he knows that you shouldn't fool around in front of an open mic. Instead of counting to 10 and forwards or backwards, he said, I've just passed legislation outlawing the Soviet Union, and the bombing begins in 5 minutes. Well, the media reported that, and then Reagan got outraged at the media and blamed the media for the controversy because they had reported what he had said. Of course, conservatives had another complaint. They said it was just another one of Reagan's broken promises. While newsmen are responsible for what actually happens in the world, they are not, I should say, responsible for what actually happens in the world. They are responsible for the selection process in deciding what to report, and that is obviously an area that involves judgment. It involves judgment simply because, as I said earlier, there is not enough time to report all the news in one newscast or to include it all in one daily newspaper or one weekly magazine. There is a never-ending competition for time and space. For years at NBC, we used to joke about how David Brinkley might deal with the 10 Commandments when he was doing the evening news, Chen Huntley. He decided he would do something like this. Good evening. Moses came down from the mountain today with the 10 Commandments. Here are reports on 2 of them. I can assure you there is no infallible formula for deciding what news to cover and what news to put on the air. And believe me, I can assure you that editors and publishers are not perfect. However, you should be aware of the fact that the people who make the news decisions are generally people with a great deal of experience in the field and people who do not have either a personal or a political or a financial stake in what is being reported or, for the most part, in how it is being reported. Now, I say that in consideration of the oft-heard complaint about so-called slanted news, a supposed bias among newsmen, especially a liberal bias. Wes Gallagher, the former head of the Associated Press and a man for whom I once worked, has written that criticism of the media by the public rises in direct proportion to the amount of news read or heard that does not fit the readers' or listeners' preconceived ideas of what the news should be. Often what we're really talking about here is a difference of perceptions, the difference between the insider and the outsider. As a senator noted during a hearing on American involvement in Nicaragua, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. We reporters like to tell the story of a tourist who comes over from Northern Ireland, meets an American, and the American says, "Where are you from?" The guy says, "I'm from Northern Ireland." The American says, "Oh my God, you're from Northern Ireland? How can you live there? You know, all the bombing and the killing and the constant shooting and death and destruction all around. How do you stand it?" And the guy from Northern Ireland says, "Oh, don't believe all that stuff that you read in your newspapers and see on your television. A lot of it is exaggerated and it's just blown way out of proportion." And the American says, "Well, I'm certainly relieved to hear that. What do you do in Northern Ireland?" And the guy says, "I'm a tail gunner on a milk truck." Let me give you an example of a real-life difference in perceptions. After the Exxon Valdez oil spill, a week of headlines, stories, reports, the White House Chief of Staff, John Sununu, complained 75% of the oil didn't spill. You don't read anything about that. Several years ago, a well-known atheist by the name of Madeleine Murray O'Hair used to make headlines every once in a while. And I once covered one of her news conferences, and she told us we couldn't be objective in reporting about her if we believed in God. According to her, that meant our point of view was already influenced against her. And my own view about reporters is that they should be somewhat schizophrenic. On the job, they try to remain detached and objective, but off the job, they are real people. They have real views, they have personal opinions, feelings. The good ones, I think, are like the doctor who examines you professionally in his office and treats you one way, and then sees you at a social occasion at night and treats you another way. You certainly hope he does. When I covered the Civil Rights Revolution in the South, as pointed out, I was in Selma and Birmingham and almost all the civil rights battlefields. I had no doubts in my mind as to what was right and wrong, but I was there as a reporter and not as an editorial writer. I felt I was doing my job properly when both sides complained, and they often did. The white power structure used to complain that I was propagandizing for radical outside agitators, and the demonstrators complained that I wasn't. However, when a white segregationist split my head open with an axe handle, I thought that was carrying the complaints a little too far. It is another responsibility of the media to be as objective as possible at all times. For non-journalists, the concept of objectivity is most difficult to comprehend when your country is involved in a military operation and lives are at stake. But even in that case, the reporter on the job is concerned as an observer, not a participant. He is professionally neutral. He's not there as a cheerleader, but a scorekeeper. Once when I was traveling on one of the shuttles with Kissinger and it wasn't going very well, he had a big flap there were 14 of us who traveled in the back of his plane. I once had a button printed up that read, "Free the Kissinger 14. We spent so much time there. But he was very unhappy about the way we had treated President Anwar Sadat of Egypt in a news conference. He threatened not to take us on any more trips and complained that we were ruining diplomacy and ruining the mission, and it was simply a reflection of the fact that his mission wasn't going all that well. And then I ended up talking to him in his cabin about what we did and how we did it. And ultimately, after he calmed down a little bit, he finally said, "Well, I know you're all sitting there in the back of the plane rooting for me to succeed." And I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Secretary, I don't mean to be too blunt. And I have to tell you very frankly that while we may be sitting in the back of the plane as American citizens rooting for you to succeed, as reporters, we don't care whether you succeed or fail." Well, he looked at me as though I had just told him the plane were landing in Albania. And he said, "You can't be that objective." And I said, "Well, that's our job, and that's what we try to do." I'm not sure that he ever came around to sharing that point of view. Military involvement, because of the security concerns, automatically raises the question of what kind of restraints, if any, should be placed on the media. In general, my answer is none. However, just as in covering trials or matters involving personal privacy, where there must be a balance between the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment, I think there must be a balance between press freedom and military security. However, too often, restrictions made in the name of security, national or otherwise, are simply designed to prevent the disclosure of information that is negative or merely embarrassing and that has nothing to do with security. Let me read to you from a recent interview in a newspaper, an interview of somebody named James Lemoyne, who covered the build-up to the Gulf War for the New York Times. And he said, the images you get of this war are being selected by the Pentagon. I've covered wars in Central America, South America, and Northern Ireland, and I've never been controlled the way I was in Saudi Arabia. You walk into a Pentagon briefing office, this happened. I saw a desk full of dossiers with names of reporters. They were analyzing each person's story to decide who would be given access. I went up and talked to a guy there and said, what do you actually do here since you don't give us interviews? He said, I analyze the image of the war and send a brief to the Pentagon, which then decides based on that how briefings will take place. Our government is very acute about the power of television. Print reporters actually have much more freedom. I watch this kind of thing. An ABC guy was going to go up to talk to a private in the field. The private was dirty. The private had a bandana on his head. The private looked like a bum. A guy walks up from the Pentagon and says, hold on, takes the private away. The private comes back in a very clean uniform and a perfect Jeep and turns around and says, okay, I'm ready. I think that was the real intent of the restrictions imposed in the Persian Gulf War, to make sure there was no negative news, to make sure there was no embarrassing news. To understand the genesis of those restrictions, go back to Grenada, and Panama, and ultimately back to Vietnam itself, with a flyby of the Falklands Islands. In 1982, I covered the Falkland Island War from the trenches of Buenos Aires. War was hell. The Argentine military wouldn't let reporters go to the islands themselves, so the greatest danger we faced came from the daily ingestion of huge amounts of cholesterol contained in some of the world's best beef. On the other side of the war, the British military, unhampered by a First Amendment, imposed extremely tight restrictions on reporting of the war. That tight British control was much admired in the Pentagon, where many of the officers who had held junior or middle-level rank in Vietnam were now top brass. And many of them still blame the media for having, quote, lost the war in Vietnam. A year later, during the invasion of Grenada, those officers went the British one better. They simply excluded the media, including me, for the first 3 days. And this time, I was forced to cover the war from the trenches of Barbados. Again, the greatest danger there was overexposure to the brilliant Caribbean sun. But facetiousness aside, the frustration level was very high for journalists in both VA and Barbados. While the media squawked loudly about Grenada, they were astonished to discover that the public at large overwhelmingly supported the restrictions in public opinion polls taken in the wake of the invasion. And while those restrictions were imposed in the name of national security, what they really did was to cover up the gross ineptitude of American military forces which carried out the invasion. The exclusion of the media eventually came to be seen for what it was. This is a blatant act of censorship, more befitting a dictatorship than a democracy, and eventually the public opinion polls shifted. But after Grenada, the press and the Pentagon agreed on guidelines for coverage of such events in the future. The military suggested that reporters be allowed to accompany troops into combat while strapped to the front of a tank. That was rejected by the media. But they did finally work out some guidelines. And then when the military went into Panama, those guidelines were virtually ignored. So it was not surprising that the U.S. military applied the Falklands, Grenada, Panama doctrine of restricted coverage to the war in the Persian Gulf. The Pentagon said the requirements for pool coverage and copy review do not represent censorship, but then the Pentagon referred to civilian casualties as collateral damage. Here's how one Air Force officer began a briefing for a group of pool reporters in Saudi Arabia. I'm not a great fan of the press, and I want you to know where we stand with each other. I suppose the press has its purpose. But one thing is certain, you can't do me any good and you sure as hell can do me harm. And what about the public reaction this time around? Well, it was Grenada deja vu all over again, as Yogi Berra might say. The media restrictions in the Gulf were overwhelmingly supported by the public at large, and some polls showed that 2/3 of the public wanted even tighter controls. We should have been flying yellow ribbons for the First Amendment. When President Bush and the Pentagon proclaimed that this war would not be another Vietnam, they certainly meant it as far as the media were concerned. There would be no unlimited coverage, as there had been in Vietnam. In the wily, trenchant words of a New York Times media critic, the Pentagon won ground superiority over the press before it achieved air superiority over the Iraqis. This was to be the good news war, in capital letters. The only bombs we saw were smart ones. For the first few weeks of combat, not a single dead American was seen on television. We did see dead Iraqis, courtesy of Cable News Network, but CNN and its correspondent in Baghdad, Peter Arnett, were constantly vilified throughout the war. One American military officer, when asked during a press briefing if Saddam Hussein was using the Al-Rashid Hotel in Baghdad, that was the hotel where the foreign press stayed, if Hussein was using that hotel as a base for military operations, he replied, yeah, he might be there. He probably sleeps in the same room with Peter Arnett. Well, Arnett was doing a job, and he was doing it probably as well as it could be done under the circumstances. And I, for one, was glad that there was an experienced war correspondent whose record I knew was there, rather than someone I had never heard of. In fact, a lot of the networks ultimately resorted to using British or other foreign newsmen about whom I knew nothing, and therefore had no reason to trust at all. Now, let me ask about Arnett. Was he subject to, and I quote exactly here, press restrictions under which journalists are assembled in groups and given access to military sources? The pool reporters obtain information while under military escort, and their accounts are subject to scrutiny by military censors before being distributed. End of quote. Well, let me tell you where that quote comes from. It is lifted verbatim from the New York Times, which ran a little box every day to explain some of the information appearing on American military operations that day was obtained under such circumstances. Journalists assembled in groups and given access to military sources. The reporters in the pool obtain information while under military escort, and their accounts are subject to scrutiny by military censors before being distributed. Same thing that Peter Arnett went through in Baghdad. One man's censorship is another man's propaganda. Before getting off this subject, let's take another look at Vietnam and the media mythology. In Vietnam, there was television and no censorship. In Korea, there was censorship and no television. Yet, historical analysis shows that public support for the war, in both cases, declined at almost exactly the same rate among the same groups as time went by. The media, especially television, documented the loss of the war. They did not cause it. Nevertheless, given the overwhelming success of the military operations in the Persian Gulf, I have no doubts that the press policy there will now be SOP, standard operating procedure, for any future military engagements. And the people who will suffer the most because of that will be the American people at large, because they won't be getting all the news that's fit to print. They won't be getting the information they need to make intelligent decisions about public policy and democracy. And that is the real value of the First Amendment. In Vietnam, we learned about the malfunction of the M16 rifle and the problems with helicopters and the falsification of body counts and the massacre at My Lai, not from military briefings, not through the chain of command, but from the media's reporting. And the media's reporting of what they were being told by soldiers on the ground. And then I would remind you that in the Persian Gulf War, right up until the very end, Baghdad radio was reporting to the Iraqi people the victory of the Iraqi forces in the field. Some of the same issues, I think, were involved in the case of the Noriega tapes, which was really just a blip on the screen. The tapes were news. CNN is in the news business, which is why it was the recipient of the tapes. Those tapes raised the question of whether the government was eavesdropping on conversations between a defendant and his lawyers. That was embarrassing to the government and potentially harmful to its prosecution of Noriega. But that doesn't mean that the tapes should be suppressed. Now, let's go back to that complaint about the so-called, or the perceived liberal bias in the media. The press critic of the Los Angeles Times, David Shaw, observes that reporters are more likely to be liberal because they are iconoclasts than because they are ideologues. Journalists love to challenge the status quo, and preservation of the status quo is, almost by definition, a conservative impulse. For all the complaints about the supposedly dominant liberal culture in the United States, conservatives remain in control of the most powerful institutions in our society. Conservatives are the establishment, and would-be journalists are given anti-establishment inoculations at birth. Whatever the corruption, be it a liberal or a conservative administration, the reporter will expose it, gladly, gleefully, regardless of the ideology of the target. And it's wrong-headed to insist bias is the rule rather than the exception in the better news organizations. In most of the areas I've touched upon so far, I think much of the current grumbling about the media has simply to do with the cyclical nature of political history. The more popular a president, the more unpopular the media. The more unpopular the president, the more popular the media. The public does want us to be a watchdog, but not when we're watching somebody they like a lot. After Jimmy Carter lost the 1980 election, he told us in one of his last news conferences that he wished Ronald Reagan two things. He wished that Menachem Begin would stay on as Prime Minister of Israel, and he wished that Sam Donaldson would stay on as ABC correspondent at the White House. They were not friendly wishes. Now again, in discussing the watchdog role of the media, I think perception enters into it. Reporters, media, were once seen as David versus Goliath. Then in the age of television and 60 Minutes and national magazines and large newspaper chains, they came to be seen as bigger and bigger, perhaps too big, perhaps too powerful. They, the media, became Goliath. This perception then engendered public resentment. Leaving aside the question, if they have so much power, what is it they can do with that power? How is it exercised? There is one area where I think the media are vulnerable in this regard. They do have the power to destroy. I recently saw a cartoon depicting a courtroom scene with the jury foreman delivering the jury's verdict to the judge, and the caption read, "Your Honor, we find the defendant guilty as charged by the media." So it's another responsibility of the media to exercise their power carefully and responsibly. At the same time, it's worth pointing out, as David Brinkley has done, that there are numerous countries in the world where politicians have seized absolute power and muzzled the press. There is no country in the world where the press has seized absolute power and muzzled the politicians. The people on television are aware of their image problem, as exemplified by this letter that was circulated within NBC News just before I left the organization. It's a letter to an advice columnist, and it reads, "Dear Ann, I have a problem. I have two brothers. One brother is in television, the other was put to death in the electric chair for murder. My mother died from insanity when I was 3 years old. My sisters are prostitutes, and my father sells narcotics to high school students. Recently, I met a girl who was just released from a reformatory where she served time for smothering her illegitimate child to death. But I've fallen in love with her, and I want to marry her. My problem is, if I marry this girl, should I tell her about my brother who's in television?" While the media obviously have their faults, I think most of the sins of journalism are committed not in the name of power or arrogance or monopoly, but in the name of pursuit and competition, in the name of eagerness to outdo one another. All news organizations are profit-making organizations, or they are meant to be, and that has even come to include USA Today. We refer to USA Today as the newspaper for people who find television news too demanding. So news organizations tend to find ratings and circulation and advertising figures rather important. A And that is especially true in today's atmosphere of austerity and shrinkage and uncertainty in the broadcasting industry. And so they compete fiercely for ratings, for circulation, and down at the reportorial level for pride and professional satisfaction. My own view of what's going on with the media and the public in general is that there's a kind of sociological delayed reaction. In the 60s and 70s in this country, every major institution went through an upheaval. There was a revolt against authority in almost every aspect of American life. The presidency, the Congress, the church, even priests and nuns were rebelling. The universities, students were taking over administration buildings and demanding to have a voice in running the place. Not even the military, with all of its discipline, was immune, especially in Vietnam, where it was carried to such an extreme that enlisted men were fragging NCOs and officers in the field. Virtually nothing was sacred. Institutional authority was challenged across the board. And during this period, the media rode high with Vietnam and Watergate. There was blood in the water, and all the goldfish turned into piranha. Believers became skeptics, skeptics became cynics, and many journalists began to see themselves almost as prosecutors. And they began to define their role primarily in opposition to the powers that be. The only institution which did not undergo upheaval during this period of American life was the institution of the press, the media. So what we may be seeing now is a challenge to their authority, delayed but inevitable. There is a feeling now that the media ought to be more responsible and certainly more accountable. That brings me to another important point. The press and the media are all lumped together in the public mind, but they are all different and they all have different needs, different responses. The National Enquirer is just as protected by the First Amendment as I am. National Enquirer can report that a woman turned into a cat after eating pet food for 20 years. Or more recently, headline in National Account, Elvis spotted in Saudi Arabia promises to pray for the troops. Okay, but I don't want to be identified in any way with the National Enquirer. The same is true, you're not familiar with it here, I guess, but the same is true of the New York Post. I like to think that the New York Post is printed as a daily challenge to our commitment to the First Amendment. In Washington, Jack Anderson's column appears on the comics pages of the Washington Post. Evans and Novak are known as errors and no facts. And news organizations are not homogeneous. They're made up of individuals. Some of them are very good reporters and some of them are not. You've heard the story about the tourist who goes to New York and asks someone on the street, "Excuse me, but how do you get to Carnegie Hall?" And the New Yorker replies, "Practice, practice, practice." Well, that's how the good reporters get to be where they are. And I hope that you have learned to distinguish among reporters, to trust and know the good ones, and avoid the bad ones. Now, the media do not always succeed at what they try to do, and I was reminded of this personally after visiting my daughter's 4th grade class many years ago to talk about current events. She went to a private school in New York, and so I went up and talked to them about current events, and afterward got the requisite thank you note on 3-ring line paper written in pencil, saying, "Dear Mr. Valeriani, 4th grade would like to thank you for talking to us about current events. We thought it was very informative and we enjoyed it. One of the interesting things we learned was that it is hard to understand what's going on in the world." So there you are. There is no question that the media need to undertake more self-criticism and more self-examination. It's not always easy to do for individuals or organizations. They keep saying it and recognize the need for it, and they don't do it. They don't have a self-policing mechanism, and frankly speaking, they won't have it. There is too much resistance, and there is no organizing impetus. Former Secretary of State Alexander Haig once wrote an article for TV Guide critical of television news, and he complained specifically that TV could derail diplomacy. Without accepting his premise, I could agree with his conclusion, which was, television news will ultimately mature or the public will not give it credence anymore. That indeed, he said, is what is most healthy about our system of a free and unencumbered press. The system is self-correcting. Correction sometimes comes at great cost, but it will be, in the end, inevitable. And I think the decline in ratings in television news perhaps is proving this point. Now, in summing up, I'd like to pass along an opinion rendered by a federal district judge in Washington, D.C. He wrote, "A cantankerous press, an obstinate press, a ubiquitous press, must be suffered by those in authority in order to preserve the even greater values of freedom of expression and the right of the people to know." That opinion might have been inspired by de Tocqueville's observation many years before, that in order to enjoy the inestimable benefits that the liberty of the press ensures, it is necessary to submit to the inevitable evils that it creates. A more up-to-date version came from Alan Barth, an editorial writer at the Washington Post. He wrote that if you want a watchdog to warn you of intruders, he must put up with a certain amount of mistaken barking. But if you muzzle and leash him and teach him decorum, you will find that he doesn't do the job for which you got him in the first place. Some extraneous barking is the price you must pay for his services as a watchdog. A free press is the watchdog of a free society. In the final analysis, the First Amendment was designed not to protect us, the media, but you, the people. And it is you, the people, to whom the media are finally responsible and accountable. You have the right to demand of us as much objectivity as we can bring to a story. And you have the right to demand fairness. It is one of the most important responsibilities of the media, always to be fair. Above all, the media have the responsibility for observing Joseph Pulitzer's 3 cardinal rules for good reporting. Rule number 1 is accuracy. Rule number 2 is accuracy. And rule number 3 is accuracy. Besides, as a lawyer said to me while I was covering the trial of former Israeli Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, the libel trial in New York, the best defense against libel is the truth. At the same time, I think that the media have the right to ask of you a thoughtful understanding of what it is they try to do. And for someone who gets 1 minute and 30 seconds to say his piece normally, I thank you for all the extra time, and I thank you for coming, and if you do have some questions, I'll try to provide a moving target. Thank you.
If you have any questions, the microphone is in the center, and go ahead and line up, please. Try to do one question at a time, and we'll see how our time goes.
I have a question and a comment. You mentioned in your speech that, which I enjoyed and appreciated,
That the reporter is there as an observer, not a scorekeeper.
No, I said he's there. He's not there as a cheerleader. He is there as a cheerleader.
He is there as an observer and a scorekeeper. And I'd like to suggest that when the media, in certain issues, they are not scorekeepers, but score makers today. And there's some perception, at least on my part, as you use the story of the pirate, or the private in the military who was dressed up for the press, that there is some feeling on my part that that this morning you have put on a good uniform for the public. The specific issue that I have concern with is the issue of media bias, which you indicated that you felt really didn't occur, and yet I believe it's demonstratable that it does occur in several ways. One through, only in certain issues, one through using labels or portraying one side or the other consistently, negatively or positively, by reporting events that occur on one side and not on the other. By basically that kind of falsifies the news. And I would specifically like to bring up an issue of police brutality here this morning as a demonstration. I wonder how many in our audience have seen the reports of the police brutality in the media, and how many would be familiar with the name of the chief of police of the Los Angeles Police Department. I'm sure that everybody here is very, very well aware because the media has given great coverage. Yet I have in my possession videotapes of police brutality by the Los Angeles Police Department and other police departments that involves broken arms, near death, women who are dragged by their bras through the sections of the prisons that are male, fully exposed, badgered by the police with threats of rape, etc. This is coercive. It is ordered by the police department, and yet it cannot receive media attention because it involves the abortion issue, and it involves people involved in Operation Rescue. And I would dare to say that nobody here, or very few, are aware that this incredible police brutality, including a man who died, there's paralysis involved, a man that almost died in his prison.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm trying to make a point. I would like to challenge the media to be fair in that issue as well as other issues, and even point out to the people that are participating in this forum this morning, if they look in their program, this type of bias of characterization is evident in the ridiculous characterization of Attorney Jack Thompson that's in the program that you have in your pockets. And I just simply want to challenge that point that you made.
Okay, challenge noted. I guess I failed to disarm you. Is there a question anywhere? Go ahead.
I have two questions. The first one is how come you don't see very many women reporters in the war zones? Is that a personal choice or is that chosen for them?
I can't answer that question. The ranks of television and even newspapers now have increased in terms of the representation of women by large numbers. I suspect it has, since women are, I won't say new to the field, but fairly new. I guess that there aren't many women who have had experience in covering wars, and so that the organizations tended to send people who had experience. I guess that's the old catch-22, how do you get experience if you never go? But I saw some women out in the field covering this time, ABC, and I saw a couple some of the pool reporters. But I think it's probably a reflection of experience more than anything else.
I see. Okay, my second question is, what's the best advice you can give me as a future reporter?
The best advice to give you as a future reporter, are you a student here? The best advice at this stage I would give you is to study hard and to absorb as much as you can now, because this is going to be the most intense learning period of your life. You'll never have this experience again, and I'm sure everybody tells you the same thing, but when you get out you come to realize that it's true, and that's why everybody was telling you that while you're here. You can learn all you need to know about journalism, I think, when you go out and get your job. Get a job at a newspaper. Go out and get a job at a local newspaper or a small town newspaper in a community not too far away or whatever, and get some experience. Get experience under your belt and learn your craft. And then think about moving on up. Do you want to do print or television, or do you care? Mm-hmm. Well, there is no simple answer to that question. And when I did television, there really wasn't much television news, and so television went outside of its own medium to attract print reporters. I was an Associated Press reporter. I still think that's the best possible training. Wire service reporting, a couple of years of that, is the best possible experience you can get for the business. First of all, it gives you a solid grounding, and it gives you a lot of self-confidence that you can cover any story. These days, however, a lot of people go directly from communications courses or college and go to work at a local TV station and then go right up through the broadcast ranks. That seems to be fairly acceptable these days because of the emphasis on production and on the visual side of the news. But If I were doing it again, I'd do a wire service for a year and then make the move.
Thank you.
I used to watch all three networks for the afternoon news, especially after I heard one commentator talking about Mr. Reagan's staging of his press conferences. And so I flipped over to CBS and NBC to see how they handled it. And the words were a little more selected, but I took offense to the word staged, and I thought that was an editorial comment. Would you comment on something like that, please?
Yeah, there's always I doubt that they said that he staged the news conference unless it was during a campaign and the news conference were held at some particular site to make a point.
He was president, and he was standing with the red carpet in the back. And
At the White House?
yes, at the White House. And
Well,
one of
I
the
don't-
guys did say staged, and I
Yeah.
was very offended by that.
Well, I can't address that particular instance, but I am surprised to hear, I'll take your word for it, they use the word staged. I'm surprised to hear they would use that in that context. I mean, they talk about if the president goes and makes a speech about immigration, and he does it in front of the Statue of Liberty, obviously it's a staged event. And the Reagan people were pretty open about their willingness to stage events and to produce the visual for the day. And if you read the accounts of the Reagan administration that were published afterwards, accounts by Deaver and who was the press secretary, who said he actually made up quotes for the president, they were quite open about their willingness to do that. So I think that when it happens, it is part of our job to let you know that it's part of the process. I'm surprised, as I say, to hear someone say that a news conference at the White House is staged. You're right, because there's a certain pejorative connection to that.
I miss you at NBC too, thank you.
I just wanted to ask you, as a reporter, where do your greatest obligations lie if you're challenged between reporting a story that is important to the public or in keeping the confidentiality of your sources? If there's a story that you know is a big story that people need to know about, but the only information you have is stuff that you've said would be off record, what do you do in that case?
Well, if you're a reporter and you get material off the record means just that, off the record, that it's not for use. You know, anybody that you have a relationship with that gives you material off the record has to know you pretty well and to trust you. I mean, if I met somebody for the first time in an official capacity and said, I'm going to tell you it's a big story off the record, I'd figure either he's very naive or he wants me to publish this. He doesn't know who I am. Why would he tell me this off the record? He's saying, well, he wants to get the story out, but he doesn't want his name associated with it. So it depends on your relationship. When you deal with me, you know what I am. I'm a reporter. My job is to find out as much as I can about what's going on and then tell everybody else about it. So basically, you shouldn't expect to tell me anything that you don't expect to see in print or on the air. That's sort of fundamental. Now, there are cases. I'll tell you a story about when the U.S. Embassy was taken over in Tehran. I was covering the State Department, and I asked at the briefing, like 3 days running, how many people were in the embassy? And the official spokesman said, we don't have an exact count. So I started calling people up privately, in effect screaming at them and saying, what is wrong with you? Are you people so stupid that you don't even know how many people you had in your own embassy, for God's sakes? No, we don't have a count. Finally, I took out a guy from the Middle East Bureau and took him to lunch and supplied him with 3 martinis. And finally he said, will you shut up and stop asking that question? He said, you're too stupid to realize that some of them got away. And we don't want the Iranians to know that, and so we're not giving any numbers because they know how many people they have, and we don't want to say how many people were there. So now I have a big story. 6 people escaped. But can I use that story? I can't use that story. I call up my editors, my producers. Believe it or not, there was a producer who wanted to put it on the air. And I said, you know, we have the story, we've got to sit on it because it would be like giving the Nazis Anne Frank's address. And so we sat on that story until they were released. Now, another example, at the same time, I found out with a little detective work that the administration was sending Ramsey Clark, sending a special mission to Tehran to try to deal with it, negotiate the release of the hostages. They were sending Ramsey Clark and a guy from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And I found out when they were leaving, I had a crew there to get pictures of them departing. We were the only ones who had it. So when I went to the State Department to get confirmation, the press spokesman said, well, I can't talk about that. And half an hour later, he called me back and he said, the secretary has asked me not to use that story. And I said, well, it's too late. I've already prepared it, told my producers about it, they're going to lead the show with it. If you don't want to use, you've got to call New York and talk to the president of NBC News, which they did. And they called and said, we appreciate it if you wouldn't use this story because we do not yet have permission to land. And if we put the story out before we have that permission, it will look like we're trying to put public pressure on them to get the mission there, and it will probably cause the mission to abort. So NBC agreed not to publish the story, not to use the story, did not use it on nightly news until the State Department had permission for the mission to land. The permission came in around 2 in the morning. The State Department called me at home and said, okay, you can use the story now, so I went in and did it for the Today Show the next morning. But basically, there are certain common sense guidelines to follow, but basically, as I say, I'm in the business of reporting. You know what I do, and when you tell me something, you have a purpose. There are other times I have to maybe sort out in my own mind, why is this person telling me this? And the fact that he is telling me that may become part of the story. That happened frequently during Vietnam, when certain stories were leaked so openly that the process of leaking became part of the story itself.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Valeriani, you said in the conclusion of your speech that you felt the public had a right to demand fairness from the news media. And I'm wondering, as a practical matter, how the public can exercise that right. Once a story is published or a broadcast is made, nothing can bring it back, and no correction or clarification or amplification can ever achieve the same degree of impact that the original report did. Can you explain to us how we can exercise that right with our...
Yeah, you're right. That's a very difficult question. What you hope for is to establish standards for reporting in the community over a period of time. If there is a bad story, and it can be demonstrated to be a bad story, you really have to go on the attack with the newspaper, and the newspaper is the publisher, the managing editor, the editor. As I indicated, the mindset has changed. The atmosphere has changed somewhat. When I first started out in a small paper in Trenton, New Jersey, if you wrote a story and the mayor didn't like it, the mayor called up the publisher or the managing editor would call you in and say, well, you know, what have you done here? Those folks are awfully angry, you know, straighten out, or straighten up, get this stuff right. Today, the atmosphere almost is, the managing editor would call you in and say, boy, you really got them riled up at City Hall, good going. What you've got to do is make sure that you're on solid ground for starters, and that's why I emphasize so much the difference in perceptions, because I had a friend, a good friend who was a judge in Philadelphia. Good family man, good Catholic, 52 years old, and had some little, second child of God, and had an affair with the secretary, got into print, and it was kind of messy for a while. And the governor was going to reappoint him, but then women's groups got involved, he campaigned against him. As there were hearings, the upshot was that he did not get reappointed. So he was very unhappy and wanted to sue the paper, and he sent me clippings, a whole stack of clippings, and I went through them very carefully. Philadelphia Inquirer mostly. What the Inquirer had done basically is simply report almost verbatim what had happened, what had been said in the hearing, what the women's groups had said. In fact, anything that came out against him, he blamed on the newspaper rather than on the women's group, rather than on the senators who opposed him, whatever. He saw it only as the newspaper and not the newspaper reporting the forces that were arrayed against him. And I sent it back with a long letter and finally called him up and I said, you know, you have no case here. This reporting is very straightforward. It's not biased, it's biased against you from your point of view because these people are saying what you consider to be horrible things against you, and the newspaper is printing them. You know? It's like a famous line of John Shenson was covering, I guess he got booted out, the 1964 convention, the Goldwater Convention, where people there, and he was writing notes, and people would come and say, look at him, he's writing down what you said. What you have to do is, I say, make sure that you establish in the community that there are high standards for reporting, and when those standards are not maintained, that you get to the institutions, be they television stations, be they newspapers, to make sure that that reporter is not allowed to continue to report in that fashion. Now, those institutions, and I say this with some hope, for the most part, are responsible institutions. They're in the business to report the news, bring you the news accurately. And so if there are aberrations, they will try to eliminate them. And if there's a bad reporter, basically, the bad reporting catches up with them, and they'll get rid of it. But the one thing you shouldn't do is let it pass. Now, it's easy for me to say the standard response to that is, oh, well, you have the power of the purse. You don't like the newspaper, don't buy it. You don't like the TV news, turn it off. That's a little too glib, as we all know. You're going to watch TV news, you're going to read a newspaper. If you only have one newspaper in town, that's the newspaper you're going to buy. Or if you don't buy it, at least you're going to read it and let somebody else buy it. But don't be afraid to complain. Yes, ma'am.
Well, first of all, let me congratulate you on holding my attention for 50 minutes. Not too many speed makers can.
Thank you.
However, I have a conflict. You made a statement that says that you're there to accurately be objective for the news, and I'm hope to see that one of these days. However, I find it difficult to understand how profit and news seem to work so hand in hand. And I wonder if the news is made by the profit that you make or not make. I'd like for you to respond to that.
Well, as I indicated, all news organizations hope to be profit-making. I will make the distinction between the reporter and the business department. I covered, I worked for a small paper, and then I worked for 4 years for the Associated Press, and I worked for NBC for almost 28 years, and not once during that time did any business department or anybody from the business department, as far as I know, intrude in any way on anything that I did. Now, the closest that I came to that was when I was covering the Pentagon. I did a story on another cost overrun of the Lockheed C-5A. I call it the Mount Rushmore of cost overruns. And the way Lockheed handled that was the chairman of the board, the corporation, Lockheed Corporation, wrote a letter to the chairman of RCA, which then owned NBC. Now, the chairman of RCA simply passed it along to the president of NBC. But when it gets down to the news department with the signature of the president of RCA, chairman of RCA, and the president of NBC, and then the president of NBC News, people down below tend to march off the cliff. So the long investigation came up with a portfolio or dossier like that, ultimately saying the reporting was quite sound. There was nothing wrong with it. The report was accurate, and sorry you didn't like it, but that's the way it is. But that is the only instance that I've had in all my years where there was any kind of potential infringement on the editorial side by the business side. Now, I don't know if you get here, if the journalism department gets the Columbia Journalism Review or the Washington Journalism Review. But the Columbia Journalism Review, in every issue, it publishes 6 issues a year, has a column which it calls Darts and Laurels. Laurels for good reporting, darts for bad instances. And frequently, the darts will go to newspapers that confuse reporting with business. They'll get a sponsor for some kind of event that the newspaper has, then they'll report very favorably on the corporation or something, somebody that sponsors it.
Does that also include the pay raises that the reporters get? The more they make is the more laurels that they have?
Well, a lot of places, pay for reporters is either determined by the union, that is the newspaper guild, so it's standard.
So which one is Barbara Walters in?
Pardon?
Which one is Barbara Walters in?
Well, Barbara Walters is like, she makes almost as much as, well, she doesn't. She makes about 1/5 as much as a top-rated baseball player. But the Barbara Walters case is a case of free agency in television. I mean, she was the first. Rune Arledge brought that to television. And when I grew up, television was like baseball team. You worked for a network and you didn't go anywhere else. And then Roone Arledge decided to raid, and the way you raid was by offering people more money. And if you think Barbara Walters is overpaid, you're not alone.
Well, that and Connie Chung and all of them, you know.
You're not alone.
Do
We
you
wish they
think,
would.
do you think that it might be possible with being in the early days of the formation of the New World Order, that perhaps the media worldwide should perhaps present the case before the World Court in the Forum of the United Nations for a worldwide decree on the censorship issue when it becomes a large involvement, such as Panama or the Persian Gulf or whatever issue, before you may be too tightly muzzled that perhaps the time is right where democracy seems to be spreading to take action before you're unable to?
Oh, no, I don't foresee that happening. I just think I have a great deal of faith in the American people as a group at large, in the democratic traditions and processes of this country, and I see the Gulf censorship as an aberration. And even though I think it will prevail in terms of military operation, I don't think it will spread in society at large. I don't think the American people would let that happen. And this was, speaking of the New World Order, I saw a cartoon the other day with George Bush as the waiter, and Yitzhak Shamir's at the table, and Yasser Arafat are sitting at the table, and Bush comes up with his menu, and he says, "What would you like to order from the New World Order menu?" And they both say, "We'll have the same. Don't expect a lot out of the New World Order."
Speaking about the fragile balance between the First and Fourth Amendments, I just kind of like to get your thoughts on reporting in such instances like where reporters stake out Gary Hart's condominium in Washington, or where women are reporting from the Cincinnati Bengals locker room, things of that nature.
Just had to get some sex into this, didn't we? The question with Gary Hart was that if everybody knew what he was doing and he defied them to catch him at it. In effect, he said, you know, if you think this is what's going on, catch me. And they did. He just wasn't too careful. But there was a change, as I indicated in my remarks, a change in the atmosphere that came about as a result of Vietnam and Watergate. We felt that we as the media felt we'd been lied to and deceived constantly during Vietnam, and again during Watergate. So a lot of the old rules changed. So and when I first went to Washington, as I told Tony on his television show, there was something called the Mississippi Rule. I don't know where the name came from, but it meant that you reported on somebody only in his official capacity and not in his private life. So you knew which senator was fooling around and which guy was a drunk, and a lot of people knew about John Kennedy's philandering, for example. It was not considered relevant to the job he was doing as president or as senator or as whatever. As long as he showed up at the hearing and wasn't drunk, okay. That changed after Watergate and Vietnam, and Hart was one of the first victims. But that, I believe, would not have happened to Hart if he had not been arrogant about it. He just, as I say, he came and he said, "I defy you to come get me." And so, now, at the time, I wrote a commentary about that and said the Miami Herald put 5 reporters on the case, and they staked them out around the clock. How many public issues in the campaign did they devote 5 reporters to 24 hours a day? Well, the answer is 0. It's the other side of the coin. The Cincinnati Bengals locker room is a whole other issue. We ought to ask Barbara Walters, I guess, about that. But I think women have a right to be there. But it seems to me fairly simple that an arrangement can't be worked out. I mean, I think the whole process is really, in a way, it's kind of stupid. I mean, what's the difference if you get a quote from a guy sitting around naked, or 5 minutes later after he showered and put on a pair of pants and a shirt? No big deal.
Well, I do want to thank you for coming, and I appreciated your presentation. However, something I heard sounded naive. As a husband of 21 years and a father of children, and realizing that the freedom that we all desire is the consequence of truth and truth applied, I feel an increased sense of responsibility here today, and I thank you for contributing to that. But the only way I really know how to achieve what you have challenged me to do here today, when you said that we need to know a good reporter and to trust him, and in the context of suggesting that those who choose the news for us are objective, that their perspective is objective, is to just take from them their own quotes on relevant issues, all of which we assume would be relevant or they wouldn't be making a statement. And I'd like to just borrow from a text entitled, That's the Way It Isn't, a reference guide to the media bias. It's by a fellow named L. Brent Bozell and a Brent Baker. And they quote some statements here that I just appreciate if you comment on, two of which are from, at one time, the most popular and most trusted man in the United States. That was Walter Cronkite. And Walter Cronkite said, I think most newspapermen, by definition, have to be liberal. If they're not liberal, then they can hardly be good newspapermen. One of the most trusted men ever. Secondly, we know that unilateral action in Grenada and Tripoli was wrong. We know that Star Wars means uncontrollable escalation of the arms race. We've got to shout these truths in which we believe from the housetops. That's powerful. I think it was Marx that said, give me 26 lead soldiers and I'll rule the world. We know that ideas have consequences. Here's a man sowing seeds that's presumptive, in my opinion. And I'm not trying to defend Star Wars or the comment necessarily, but the basic presupposition that is being suggested there that we all embrace automatically because he's popular. And then you made reference to Sam Donaldson, who said, you'd better be glad I'm leaving the White House beat in November, because if Bush gets elected, I'd savage him. Whatever that may mean. I'm not asking for a definition of the word savage, but the suggestion there is that there is obvious opposition and disagreement, and that most of us should draw that same conclusion. Now, my dilemma is that all conclusions are based on fundamental presuppositions. How can you suggest today that the news industry, which is highly motivated by greed and pride, can possibly be that objective? I think every one of us know that's the case. If we understand human nature and raising a family, we know that it's very difficult to be objective, because if you look up, you're not going to see what's down. If you look to the right, you're not going to see what's to the left. And we all have traditions that we try to preserve and promote and protect. And there are so many studies and surveys that indicate otherwise. And I'll sit down here just a second. Let me quote one more. This is 1981 Lichter and Rothman survey of 240 journalists working for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the U.S. News, the World Report, the Wall Street Journal, and confirmed by a 1985 survey by the Los Angeles Times. It said 90% of these reporters favored abortion. The issue here isn't abortion or otherwise. The issue is the percentage there and the influence that they're going to have in their reporting. 80% supported affirmative action. 81% voted Democratic in every presidential election from 64 through 72. More than 90% voted for Johnson over Goldwater, and more than 80% voted for Humphrey over Nixon, McGovern over Nixon, and Carter over Ford. Most blamed the U.S. for third world poverty, and more than 80% of each group seldom or never attend religious services. Less than 8% attend church regularly, and so on. You go on and on. And I'm sure some are drawing some negative conclusions. What I'm trying to suggest is naive. And I'm struggling with a dilemma. How do I receive the news and know that it's true And how do I trust that news reporter knowing what I do about human nature?
Well, as I think I tried to make clear, objectivity is difficult. And it's one part of what a reporter tries to do. You can be, in all of the issues you mentioned, you can be fair without getting personally involved in the reporting. How does a lawyer defend a murder? He's entitled to a defense, and he applies the law. The reporter does the same. He can be fair and report both sides. Now, do you want to explain to them who Brent Bozell is so they have an idea?
No. If you're going to do that, I'd appreciate it.
All right.
But let me just add something here, just to interject, to confirm. You made reference there. 97% of the media use the reference pro-choice in a highly inflammatory, controversial situation, and the same percentage use anti-rights or anti-abortion. Now that's suggestive. Automatically, it's suggestive. What if I turned that around and I said, those who are in favor of abortion are pro-death to the baby instead of pro-woman's rights? It does suggest something. And fetus suggests something instead of baby. It takes out the personality and the value. It deprives. It denies something that everybody has a right to hear.
You are talking, let's go back to the area that I'm talking about. You are talking as an insider. And you want it reported your way as the insider. I'm the outsider, and I'm reporting for everybody. The people you describe as pro-choice object to the use of the words pro-life in describing the people who are opposed to abortion. Anytime you get involved with an issue like abortion or gun control, there's no satisfying either side because neither wants to see the other side, and therefore they always come and blame us, which is part of the game. I understand that. Brent Bozell is part of the extreme right, not just right, extreme right in this country. He was one of Buckley's early allies, helped found the National Review, and then went off on his own with, the guys who did the poll, I don't know them, so I can't really comment. Yeah, well, I said, I don't know who they are, and I don't know much about the poll. But I tried to explain, now, first, the other thing I would ask you is when did Cronkite make his comments? Did he make them recently? Is he entitled to his opinion as a retired newsman or not? And I go back to the point I made about, quote, the liberal bias in newsmen. If you want to define liberal as anti-status quo, then I have no quarrel with it. So that's the point I tried to make that the guy in the LA Times, the press critic in the LA Times, tries to make. The establishment is essentially conservative, and if you're constantly looking to chip away at what's wrong, then you end up appearing to be liberal in the sense that you don't accept the status quo. Yes, ma'am.
In the early days of television, it was really common for the nightly newscast to be brought to you by Mobil Oil,
Right.
that kind of thing. Now, again, on ABC World News Tonight, we're seeing brought to you by Maxwell House. We're seeing segments of television news brought to you by, even newspapers have services sponsored by companies. Can you address a little bit, maybe not so much how that affects a reporter, but how that affects public perception as far as the news media being unbiased?
Okay. Well, it's similar to the question that this little young woman asked about profit and pay and all of that. Reporters generally don't know what the business department is doing, and for the most part don't care as long as it means they get enough space to write their story or enough time. If advertising starts to run longer and instead of 22 minutes to do your newscast tonight, you have 20 minutes, then somebody's going to complain about it. And probably you're going to lose the argument. They're going to say, well, we can make 2 more minutes of commercial time means more profit, and therefore you'll make more money, et cetera, et cetera. But as I say, in all the time that I was in the business, now I never did local television reporting, so I don't know how it impinges there, but I never saw any intrusion of the business side directly on the reporting. Now what you have today at all 3 networks, quite obviously, is a change in the approach to news as part of the overall organization of the network. I grew up when David Sarnoff was the head of RCA, which owned NBC. Sarnoff was a broadcasting pioneer. I grew up in an era when Bill Paley, fraud though he was, at least put good people in charge of CBS, and they ran it with the idea that news is important, and CBS makes an awful lot of money as a network, and therefore we can afford to lose $100 million in our news division, which they generally did, in order to cover the world. And NBC News used to lose $100 million a year. Well, GE comes in and says, oh, wait a minute. The news division has to be a profit center, just like the light bulb division. And it equates news with light bulbs. So the whole atmosphere changes. Suddenly, instead of 40 correspondents, you have 25 correspondents. Instead of 50 producers, you have 30 producers, et cetera, et cetera. And no, we can't go to do this, and no, we can't do that. And then along comes the Gulf War, and you have to cover that in a big league way. And your budget goes to hell, so you're going to see further shrinkage and reduction in the news department. That's where it impinges. I think when you have this new ownership at the network level, certainly. You have what I call the digit heads taking over, the bean counters. Eventually, I think the whole nature of news is going to change, network news certainly, and there are even some dire forecasts that one network, probably NBC because of GE, might be the first to say, hey, we don't need an evening news. Let the local stations do it. And it may come to them. Yes, ma'am.
Let's hope not.
Well, I also have, I look at the other side of the coin, which is that program is becoming so expensive now to produce, whereas news is very cheap to produce because you have everybody in place. You have to pay for those people every day. Every day, enough news comes into the newsroom at any one of the networks to put on 2 hours of news, and they shrink it down to the 22 minutes. So they could very easily go to an hour newscast. The local stations won't let them do that because the local stations make too much money in their own time putting on their own news or their own programming, even if it's syndicated, if they're doing doing Wheel of Fortune or reruns of something else, MASH or whatever, they make more money than they do carrying the network news. What a lot of people don't understand is the economics of network news. The local station does not pay the network for the evening news. The network pays the local station to carry the evening news. And so there'll be more people watching, and then we can sell it, the sponsors based on the viewership. I think that ultimately one of the networks may say, hey, 10 o'clock at night, let's put on an hour of news because it won't cost us anything. And even if we get low ratings, we'll make more money doing an hour of news at 10 o'clock than we could with an hour entertainment show, which would cost so much to produce. That's what I think ultimately will happen, rather than the other way around.
I have 2 questions, one very brief. Are we going to have another chance to question you today, perhaps at the Bonner Room, or is this our only opportunity?
This is the only chance I'm getting out of town after this.
Okay. All right. Then I have that short question and now a very long question, since that's your answer.
Wait a minute, let me reconsider my answer in that case.
I'm one who believes, and I hope I represent the majority of the Americans, I'm one who believes that the power of the press keeps us from being oppressed, keeps us from being oppressed by our own ignorance, keeps us from being oppressed by our own politicians, and I hope keeps us from being oppressed by foreign money which is trying to influence the opinion-making and the decision-making process in the United States. We know that Arab money has come in. I watched women news makers discussing this in their conference. We know that Japanese money has come in. I'm not pinpointing any specific amount of foreign money, but it is coming into the United States, and it is being allowed to affect our political, our politicians. It's not against the law for foreign money to come in and enter right into our lawmaking process, our voting and so on. I want to narrow that down to the media. How much influence do you feel foreign interests are now exerting, unknown to the American people, And I do not mean the movie industry. I mean the news industry, and I mean specifically CNN and the others who seem to, as they see where the money's going to come from, they're a lot less strident, but specifically CNN. How much influence do you think, unknown to the American public, is already being exerted by foreign?
I would say that it's practically zero. Now, the cases we know of Murdoch, for example, coming in and buying papers. Maxwell is now about to buy the Daily News in New York, two well-known British publishers. I'm afraid that their influence has not been, I wouldn't say negative politically, it's been negative in terms of good taste. They are bringing British tabloid standards to, not that we haven't had those kinds of standards here in the past with Hearst or whatever, but we'd hope to get away from some of that. We're returning to them with Murdoch and Maxwell. But otherwise, the Japanese, virtually no influence. CNN has, I'm sure you're concerned about CNN because of its reporting and its delivery of its news service in Iraq, or to the Iraqi government. It sells its service around the world, and in a way you can say that Turner has understood the global market in a way much better, much more quickly than other broadcasters. Other broadcasters in this country are now trying to hook up with British and or German and or Italian and even Russian news organizations so that they can move more quickly on a global scale. Turner is already there. In terms of foreign money, they sell the service, and they get the money for selling the service. And other than that, as a matter of fact, there's not a lot of money at CNN. If you talk to their reporters, you'll get a pretty good idea of that.
I think CNN did a great job. I think Arnett was great. I think that we knew he was being censored. He was saying he was being censored. We knew that, but somebody was there. No, I'm speaking of Ted Turner.
Yeah.
Frankly, he came with an agenda of his own, and he was sole owner, and he said, I don't care, I can slant the news, and I want this and this and this. And then two things happened. Then suddenly he wasn't the only owner, and Time Warner bought in. And
He's under a lot of restraints. He no longer,
he's under more restraints. But
he has, but as a matter of fact, he doesn't control a majority anymore.
I know he
Turner
doesn't.
Broadcasting. Commentary is off CNN, as you know, so that's one area. And I think the only way he has exerted his influence is, again, in trying to, maybe some people would say a kind of a kooky way, but he wants to maintain or wants to create a global perspective. So he has outlawed the use of the word foreign on CNN.
Exactly.
Yeah,
you can't say foreigner.
You have to say international.
And you can't say Japanese, you can say Asian, and then sometimes you can't say Asian. And he has his own agenda, and many people feel that it's not a joke. He really wants to run for the presidency of the United States.
Well, then you'll have a chance to vote against him.
And that he's toning down a lot of his violent opinions. For instance, he said, the Ten Commandments are now obsolete. Everybody...
But you'll have people like the gentleman next to you there with something written down, with a quote, when he says, he'll have the quotes to throw back at him.
Well, it's been a great pleasure having you
Thank you.
here for all of us. It's been witty, delightful, and very informative talk.
Mr. Valeriani, I just came back from the Persian Gulf. I'm in Washington International Guard, and I just got back a week ago. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk, and I appreciate you talking here today. You've done a marvelous job. One of the things that I wanted to kind of ask about and get your opinion is, we saw the pool reports. Of course, everybody saw the pool reports coming out of the Persian Gulf area. And for a great part, the media was orchestrated by General Schwarzkopf and the United States government. And the British government too, I suppose, but to the extent that the naval exercises in the Persian Gulf were blown way out of proportion, in fact, even greater than they actually were, and there was no comment whatsoever about the Western movement of over 100,000 troops. And
now, can I just interrupt you to point out on that I know reporters who were with them, who found the troops in the desert and did not report that.
I understand that.
Okay.
I understand that there were reporters there that knew about that. It wasn't that the reporters didn't know about that.
Right.
But in fact, the media was utilized, and with or
Right.
without the permission of the media. I mean, I don't
Right.
have any way to know that. They were utilized to a great extent to the benefit of the military and the operation in the Persian Gulf, and in fact saved thousands and thousands of lives, no doubt. Do you have any comment on the, I guess I would say, obvious restraint of the news media to wait a few days before they reported those troop movements and things like that, and in fact, the movement of enough materials for 1,000 troops for 60 days?
Well, as I said earlier, I thought that's one of the points I wanted to make about Vietnam. For all the complaining about Vietnam, there is no single documented case where operational security was ever violated by any member of the media. When you send experienced war correspondents to the area, they know what not to report and why not to report it. And the argument of the media is that they can be trusted to do that. The famous example is that there were reporters who knew about D-Day long in advance and went with the troops on D-Day and landed on the beaches. Combat correspondents landed on the beaches in Normandy on D-Day. So that there are common sense guides. Anytime that there's any danger that life might be at risk, you don't report it. And then you report it afterwards in some context in terms of analysis rather than the daily reporting. Just since you were there, there was one example that struck me about, a lot of the reporters turned out to be a woman who was a pool correspondent. There were people there obviously for the first time. It was after the battle at Kafji, the first time the Iraqis sent ground troops into Saudi Arabia. And one of the American tanks had knocked out 2 Iraqi tanks. And this woman, I think her name was Linda Patillo, I think she works for ABC, I didn't know at the time, she was part of the pool report, one of the pool reporters. And so she was interviewing the tanker who had fired the tow missiles and had knocked out the 2 Iraqi tanks. And so she said to him, "Did you expect to hit them?" What are you going to say? "Well, lady, I threw it up from half court, with a prayer and hoped it would go in," or like that. But he was very restrained. He said, "Yes, ma'am, that's my job, ma'am." But I thought that, I had a call from a friend of mine named Barry Dunsmore, who works for ABC, who did find the 7th Corps. He said there were 2 others that he knew of out there in Panama and did not report it until the actual attack.
One of the things that I wanted to comment on, though, was, do you feel, I know that you don't agree with the pool reporting system, you've indicated your displeasure with the lack of information that came out of the pool, and I saw some lack of information coming out of the pool too, but I was in a little different area than most people were. But if in fact the Army hadn't chosen the pool reporters so carefully, some of the things that didn't get reported could have very easily got reported, and a lot of things could have happened.
Well, that is the argument on the other side. My point being that I know of reporters who knew about the movement westward of the 7th Corps, or whatever the other major group was, who did report it because they understood that it was important in terms of security. Now, the more persuasive argument there is, well, wait a minute. Here we are in this vast area. Suddenly we got 1,500 reporters out here with cameras and tape recorders and pencils, and they want to go all over. We can't, we've got to restrict them somehow. Well, it seems to me one way you can do it, it would cause other problems, but one way you can do it is limit access in the first place. Just because you have a press pass doesn't mean that you can go cover the war in the military zone. Is it necessary for WNBC in New York to have its own reporter in the field? For what reason? For the sake of being able to say we have our own reporter in the field. A reporter maybe who's never covered a war before. Or WCBS in New York, or pick whatever the local station is or the local newspaper to say, well, I want to go out, the local paper would say, here, I want to go out and report on people from Coeur d'Alene who are in the zone. Well, either there has to be some way to deal with that many people. What I'm suggesting is that you can limit, again, the number of credentials, which is what you do at the White House. Limit the number of credentials. Thank you.
Just a quick question, if I may.
Let's have this be the final question.
Thank you. There's 2 issues that I'm wondering about. One is with regard to the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. I believe it's the understanding, which really hasn't been addressed, and particularly with regard to the Persian Gulf situation, that these freedoms are paramount except when the state has a compelling interest. The compelling interest issue, I didn't hear you specifically addressed, and with the concept that when these freedoms, paramount as they are, abridge a compelling interest for the state, then there do need to be restraints. So what is the compelling interest of the state in the military situation? And the second part ties with that, and it has to do with the economic factors in covering the war in the Persian Gulf, and that is my perception was, I have to say this is my perception, that there appeared to be in the media at the beginning of the war almost a Vietnam era reporting that highlighted the protests, et cetera, and maybe it stems from at any rate, then there appeared to be a groundswell of public opinion damning the media, so to speak, and it was aired. The media was fair about airing that. I appreciated that. But then a decided shift in the emphasis of the media that was perceptible during the course of the war. And it seems to me that media itself is influenced by economic factors. Editors in the back room respond to public opinion about the media, and this too can create a...
Well, let me say this. In the first place, the compelling interest of the state has been the rationale for any dictatorship anywhere in the world. What I said in my remarks was that I think when the survival of the nation is at stake, as it was in World War II, then those kinds of factors certainly come into play. But that was not the case in Grenada or Panama, or certainly in the Persian Gulf. Two, in terms of the perceptions or the reaction of the media, I think what happened here was that, first of all, let me say I just finished an article for Columbia Journalism Review and interviewed an awful lot of people. And if there was one overwhelming complaint from people about aspects of the war, it was the reverse of what you just said, was they claimed the protesters didn't get any coverage at all. And in fact, they thought there was some kind of conspiracy to cut the protesters out. Be that as it may, that's another point of view. It's a point of view that I got a lot of. What happened was that with all the restrictions on the media and the scant amount of news and information that was coming out, you're right, the coverage sort of turned back and the media became the focus of the story for a while because they were complaining they weren't getting the news. There wasn't other news to report to take attention away from that, and people were reacting to the media's whining, and so for a while there, like after the first couple of weeks, that became a major issue. But I think the reason it became a major issue was that you could say that news abhors a vacuum. There was a vacuum, and so the media then became the subject of the coverage. The media itself became the subject of the coverage. Again, thank you all for coming.
Thank you all for your questions and your participation. The